Hi, and welcome to drawingandpaintingforeveryone.com. Today I'm going to go through the steps I use to create a portrait from a photograph. Before I get going, I need to make sure that you have this back sheet of my book copied onto acetate. You can get the acetates at Office Depot, Office Max, Staples. You'll need these small grids to go over your photo reference to enlarge. To get started, this is the photograph that I plan to paint. My students often want to use my grids to cover the complete photograph. Doing this uses large parts of the grid to draw the shirt and the background. What I need is a grid that's only on the face. Using a smaller grid gives me more information for the face. My goal in placing my grid is to have the center marks of the middle row line up with the outside corners of the eyes. I prefer that my grid aligns with the eyes. If the head has a tilt in the photograph, my grid will also have a tilt. This grid is a little small, so I'll try a slightly larger one. Again, my goal is to have the small marks in the middle row align with the outside corners of each eye. The ear will be outside the grid, but I'll simply add another column of elements to this grid to make it work out. Okay, I've taken a moment and cut my grid away from the larger sheet. Try to leave enough acetate around the grid to attach a piece of tape. Again, I'll align my grid so that this dot is on the outside of this eye and this one is on the outside of the other eye. Keep in mind the grid does not align with the edges of my photograph, but it does align with the eyes in my portrait. I'm still going to need a column for this ear. I could have made an extra copy of my grids and cut out a small extra column and taped it here, or I can just draw what I see based on the grid that I have. I've taken a moment and used the inside of my viewfinder to draw a grid on a sheet of paper. I'm going to add another column of grid elements down this right side. I need these extra elements to locate the ear. I have a tutorial explaining the grid. The tutorial uses the outside of the viewfinder rather than the inside, but you should be able to make the adjustment. Once my grid is ready, I'll do a drawing of the face on this sheet of paper. I want to keep this tutorial focused on the steps I use to build a portrait, so I'll explain drawing with a grid in a separate tutorial. This is the surface I'm going to paint my portrait. I prefer to paint portraits on a tan colored surface rather than white, so I've covered this panel with acrylic gesso tinted with acrylic burnt sienna and sap green. I've left this corner white to show my students the original color of the panel. Here's the drawing I completed. I've used a sharp pencil to punch small holes in the corners of my grid, here and here. The objective now is to decide where on this canvas I want my portrait. Do I need the head a little higher, a little lower? Should it be to the left or to the right? Do I need a little tilt to the head? I spend some time on this step because no matter how much I like the job I do painting the portrait, if it's not located nicely on the canvas, I won't like the piece. When I've settled on the location, I make two small marks on the canvas through the holes that I punched in the drawing. These two marks are directly on the canvas. From here, I reposition the viewfinder, placing the two marks that I just made on the canvas in these corners of my viewfinder. I'll place the grid directly on the canvas this time, and I'll also redraw the entire drawing right on the canvas. Before I remove the viewfinder, I mark diagonal corners of the viewfinder onto the canvas. These marks will allow me to reposition my grid as I paint. Okay, I've built my grid on my canvas and completed my drawing. I've also placed painter's tape in the corners to reposition my grid. There is one of the acetate grids that matches the opening in this viewfinder. I've also used painter's tape to hold it onto the back of the viewfinder. When I place the corners of my viewfinder on the marks on my canvas, my grid is mapped back onto my painting. Sometimes when you're painting, things begin to look wrong. Being able to reposition your grid helps keep control. It's been a couple of days since I removed the grid and started my painting. Now that my paint is dry or dry to the touch, I can reposition my grid and evaluate my likeness. I check everything. How do the eyes compare with the grid? How do the corner of the mouth compare? How do the edges of the lips compare? I keep evaluating as I work. I plan to use this painting as a teaching aid, so I'm going to stop working on it here. Under this green paint, I still have that little corner of painter's tape. If my plan was to finish this painting, my final step would be to remove these small pieces of tape. When I've removed them, there will be a slight edge between the gessoed canvas and the painted surface, but I'll simply scrape that edge away with my palette knife, match the color, and paint this small spot again. As long as I can relocate these corners, I'm able to re-establish my grid and correct anything. I know that was a lot of steps, but I go through these steps sequentially to give myself a good product every time. I hope that was helpful. Thanks.